Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to a special 5-part episode on suspension and debarment. First, a word from our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, Inc. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across all industries. With its knowledge of effective compliance and ethics programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even of individuals. Having served in over 700 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance program, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. In this 5-part series on the intricacies of suspension and disbarment, I'm joined by Rod Grandin. Rod is a managing director at Affiliated Monitors, and he's going to help us walk through what suspension and debarment is, but more importantly, why it needs to be studied, understood, and learned by the greater compliance community. We're going to take up 5 separate topics in this 5-part series. Number 1, what's the difference between criminal civil actions and suspension and debarment? 2, what's the actual difference between a suspension and a debarment? 3, what's the relationship to the FCPA and other matters to suspension and debarment? 4, what are factors considered as part of suspension and debarment present responsibility determination? And 5, what are some of the remedies and responses under suspension and debarment? I know you'll find this fascinating series very useful for you as the compliance practitioner. This special 5-part series on suspension and debarment is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, back for part 3 of my 5-part exploration of suspension and debarment. During this exploration, I'm joined by Rod Grandin. Rod is the managing director at Affiliated Monitors. Today we're going to take up the topic of why does suspension and debarment matter to compliance. So Rod, with that introduction, thank you for joining me today.
All right, thank you.
Rod, as you know, many of my listeners are in the compliance community. They may be in the anti-corruption compliance community. They may be in the anti-money laundering compliance community. They may be in the now data protection compliance community. It could be a wide variety of compliance issues. And I wondered if you could maybe start with telling us what's the relationship between the United States anti-corruption law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and your world of suspension and debarment.
All right. Well, for starters, suspension debarment, and my approach is from the procurement side of the rules. I've said in the earlier segments, there are 2 sets of rules that presently govern the U.S. government's approach to suspension debarment, the procurement rule and the common rule. Within the Department of Defense and within the Department of Air Force, where I served as the suspending and debarring official, we worked under both, but primarily under the procurement rule. And the thing to understand are the causes associated with suspension and debarment. Suspension and debarment, when you look at the rules, the procurement rule, 48 CFR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, it very specifically talks about the actions can be initiated for conviction, for indictment of, when it comes to suspension, or conviction or civil judgment for commission of fraud or criminal offenses in the connection with attempting to obtain or performing a public contract, or a violation of antitrust statutes, or violation of crimes or offenses that reflect a lack of integrity, such as embezzlement, theft, forgery, so on and so forth. It can be for affixing a label bearing a Made in America inscription, so on and so forth. And as I mentioned in an earlier podcast, when there is an indictment for suspension, you need no further evidence. When there is a conviction or a civil judgment in the context of a proposed debarment or debarment, you need no further evidence. In the absence of that, of either the indictment and suspension or the conviction or civil judgment in the debarment area, there are standards of evidence that come into play. And so for suspension, it is adequate evidence. For debarment, it is preponderance of the evidence. But once you get outside the list of specific criminal activity or specific statutory wrongs, actions can be taken for violation of terms of government contracts, for willful failure to perform contracts, for history of failure to perform, for violations of the drug-free workplace requirements that are included in federal contracts, for commission of an unfair trade practice, for delinquent federal taxes. And the list, there's a fairly extensive list, but the most intriguing proposition under both suspension and proposed debarment is what is known as the subparagraph C, which generally provides, and I'm reading from the debarment rule, that a contractor or subcontractor may be debarred based on any other cause so serious or compelling a nature that it affects the present responsibility of the contractor or subcontractor. As you can tell, that is some fairly broad language. So when we look at this in the context of corruption laws, U.S. corruption laws, we look at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and we say, well, that usually involves bribery and bad record keeping associated with that activity in the context of engagements with foreign officials. Activity that would generally fall outside the realm of a public contract or subcontract. That's entirely an accurate observation, but what's critical to recognize here is that the standard definition for contractor, as used in the rule, does not require that the entity actually have a contract in place. It's just simply that they may have a contract or may compete at some point for a contract, that they may become a contractor. So essentially, any business activity that provides goods or services that the federal government may be interested at some point in acquiring potentially could fall within the definition of contractor. So when we look to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, practically any business could fall within that definition of contractor. Again, I want to emphasize, it's not limited. These sanctions are not limited to contractors that have existing contracts, and they are not limited to misconduct that occurs in the context of a federal contract. In my experience, I have dealt with several matters involving violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, activity that was clearly outside the scope of a federal contract or subcontract, but where the conduct was committed by a federal contractor. In fact, in my case, very large federal contractors. So there is this very much a relationship between this integrity notion that drives this concept of present responsibility and conduct that violates criminal laws, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I think many in the practice area, get so focused on the criminal aspects that they lose the notion that there's very likely, certainly within the Department of Defense, to be a coordination of remedies. And that coordination effort will not just be in the context of whatever the Department of Justice does, but may very well fall to actions that can and may be taken by the suspending and debarring official.
So we've had several FCPA matters where that has been specifically addressed, and I don't think that part of it, Rod, really gets enough play, certainly in the FCPA compliance community. But I think there are other areas, the other types of matters that suspension and debarment officials consider. I was wondering if you might be able to highlight some of those for us.
Right. I touched on those briefly, but I'll go back and just illustrate, some of the provisions in the regulation. Again, anything in the context, any fraud or criminal offense in the context of attempting to attain, performing a public contract or subcontract, that's clearly within the scope. Antitrust statute violations, whether federal or state, embezzlement, theft, forgery, bribery, as we've already discussed, falsification or destruction of records, false statements, tax evasion, violating basically any federal law. Remember, the notion here is one of present responsibility. Present responsibility is not defined anywhere in the regulatory structure. It is left to the discretion of the agency suspending and debarring official. And in most cases, that official is going to look back at one, is there a cause? And then secondly, is there a reason to be concerned about the integrity of that contractor? And that gets us into a fairly deep dive of the ethics and compliance environment within that contractor's business operations.
So, Rod, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. I've been visiting with Rod Grandin, Managing Director at Affiliated Monitors, and we've been exploring why suspension and debarment matters and should matter to compliance. I hope you will join us again for our next episode. Rod, thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I hope you will join us again for our next episode. This special 5-part series on suspension and debarment is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.